if you're listening to us from outside the UK. The BBC Sounds app will soon stop being accessible overseas. There is a new BBC app, but it only allows listeners to hear Radio 4 and the World Service live. Now, you can also access selected BBC content, including podcasts. BBC Sounds, of course, is still available in the UK. And if you go abroad on holiday for a short period of time, and we don't yet have a definition of short, you will be able to use the BBC Sounds app when you're away. So you can still listen to podcasts and, of course, feedback on the beach. Now, it is a significant change, and there's been relatively little publicity since it was announced in a BBC press release last week. But news of the change has been filtering through to people who'll be affected, like Rory Campbell.
I live in Lisbon, Portugal, and I use BBC Sounds every single day. And it would be a great loss if it got switched off. I use Radio 4 myself, but my kids would benefit hugely from Radio 1 and Radio 2 because they've learned English from me, but hearing it just one person isn't the same, and they miss all the cultural references you get as well from hearing Radio 1 and 2, and you get a sense of humour, and there's a lot of stuff which they would benefit from.
Anne Longmuir, from Edinburgh originally, but living in Manhattan, Kansas. I'm an expat who has lived in the USA for over 20 years. During that period, I have listened to BBC Radio on a daily basis. Not only does it offer a way of keeping in touch with home, but the quality of programming is far higher than that available in the US. It's no exaggeration to say that BBC Radio is woven into the daily fabric of my life.
I did want to talk to someone from the BBC to flesh out the announcements contained in that press release, like why the changes are taking place, exactly what BBC content listeners abroad will still hear, and how long you can be out of the UK before BBC Sounds stops working. But no one was available. They did send this statement.
The BBC is launching an all-new listening experience on the bbc.com and BBC app, which will be the go-to destination for international fans of the BBC's audio content. For the first time, the BBC's award-winning audio content will be discoverable alongside the best of BBC journalism and storytelling, allowing listeners to benefit from a fully integrated experience. Listeners will be able to hear thousands of podcasts, as well as BBC Radio 4 and BBC World Service Radio. The BBC's content will also remain on other international podcast platforms.
And here's what the statement says about UK listeners going abroad.
In the UK, users of BBC Sounds are not impacted by the changes and will still be able to enjoy the programmes and podcasts they love on BBC Sounds, including whilst on holiday abroad for a short time. The changes will come into effect in early spring 2025.
Hi, this is Rob Lambert in Melbourne, Australia. Truly, the BBC is a world-class radio service with something for everyone. It's certainly a fair sight better than most radio praying here in Australia. I understand the need to streamline costs, but this seems to be cutting off your nose to spite your face.
We heard from Rob Lambert there in Melbourne, and we're staying in Australia because joining me now from Brisbane is James Cridland. He's editor of Pod News, the daily podcast newsletter. James is also a radio futurologist, writer and consultant on radio's future. He was writing about this move on his blog at the end of last year. James, I love your title, Radio Futurologist, and that is just what we need today, to look into the future and tell us what is it going to be like to access BBC content from overseas.
So if you're listening to anything other than Radio 4 or the BBC World Service, then you will not be able to use the BBC Sounds app, because that is going away, and so you'll lose, Radio 2 and Radio 1 and all of those stations as of early spring, apparently.
So is there going to be a new app that the BBC is going to ask people to download overseas?
Yes, there is, and it's a very good app. It's the BBC app. It really is as simple as that, and it contains the BBC News website. It contains the BBC News channel here in Australia and in the US, and contains an awful lot more, including what they're calling BBC Audio, which is all of the BBC's podcasts, which of course are funded by advertising outside of the UK, as well as live radio from the World Service and from Radio 4, which I'm really pleased about.
So this app already exists?
Yep, so the app already exists. They turned on the audio section of that a couple of weeks ago. And so, yes, so if you're listening to this outside of the UK, absolutely go and download that now. It's a really nice experience. But it does mean, of course, that we are going to lose all of the BBC's domestic radio stations apart from Radio 4. So things, of course, like Radio 2 and Radio 1, but also things like Radio Scotland. And, you know, my favourite Radio Leeds, I'm going to lose that. So, and I think that is going to be quite a shock when people find that out a little bit later on in the year.
Yeah, you talk about people finding it out. The BBC has sent out a press release about this, but it does seem to be really low key. I mean, there's no fanfare. It's absolutely nothing like, for example, the launch of BBC Sounds. How big a deal is this for the BBC?
Well, it's a big deal in terms of revenue, because it means that the BBC can properly earn revenue, earn money from advertising outside of the UK. And that's what the BBC Studios part of the BBC is all about. It's about making money, which can then go back into programmes, and that is, of course, a good thing. But, of course, as you would expect, the closure of the BBC Sounds app is kind of hidden in the second to last paragraph of that release. And so what we see is, you know, a beautiful new app for you to go and find some great audio in. That's all great. Oh, and by the way, we're going to turn off the other app. And I think, you know, as I say, I think that not very many people have realised that they are going to lose the domestic channels. Of course, you know, we have no access to the domestic TV stations here either. And so from that point of view, it does make sense. But I don't think people have fully appreciated that they are going to lose access overseas. Now, if you are travelling, if you have the BBC Sounds app, you normally live in the UK, you will be able to go on holiday and continue waking up to Scott Mills or whatever it is that you want to do. And that's all fine, but you won't be able to use it for a long period of time overseas.
Hi, my name's Maureen Nesbitt, originally from Glasgow, but I'm currently in Sydney. Many of us living overseas rely on these programmes to maintain links and feel connected with home. I would ask that anything you can do to influence the decision makers to rethink their plans and continue to let us enjoy these programmes.
It seems a shame that it's just to do with rights restrictions. I just think that if I paid the money, I should be allowed to have the service. And I'd gladly pay the money.
Yeah, the difficulty with paying is, well, as soon as you put any form of monetization for the BBC music radio stations, for example, then all of the record companies will expect to be paid in the same way that Spotify or YouTube Music pays for music. And that's one of the reasons why actually there's no advertising in the BBC Sounds app, whereas there is on the BBC website when I'm looking at that.
Just to be crystal clear, at the moment, BBC Sounds doesn't have advertising on it. This new app will have advertising around the podcast. Is that the understanding?
Yeah, so BBC podcasts have had advertising in them for a number of years now. They've very recently been doing a lot of deals with podcast companies in other countries to go out and sell that advertising even more effectively. So advertising in the BBC's shows is nothing new to people overseas. What's new here is that the BBC will, for the first time, be able to have advertising in the app, and you see an advert as you're listening to Radio 4 in there. Realistically, for those people who are listening to the incredible amount of podcasts which are available from the BBC, the incredible amount of content, not just from Radio 4 and the World Service, but all of the stations, I think that actually listening to a couple of ads and paying for the BBC in that way is probably a good thing to do.
James Cridland, editor of Podcast News. Thank you so much for that guided tour of the proposed changes. Now, we will be looking for more clarity on this from the BBC. I think there's going to be more to come from you as well, as we find out exactly how it's going to impact overseas listeners. But that's all for today.
Be cutting off your nose to spite your face.
We heard from Rob Lambert there in Melbourne, and we're staying in Australia because joining me now from Brisbane is James Cridland. He's editor of Pod News, the daily podcast newsletter. James is also a radio futurologist, writer and consultant on radio's future. He was writing about this move. So is there going to be a new app that the BBC is going to ask people to download overseas?
Yes, there is, and it's a very good app. It's the BBC app. It really is as simple as that.
Let's enjoy these programmes.
It seems a shame that it's just to do with rights restrictions.